Hi everybody, this is Anne. In this video, I'll demonstrate a resist decorating technique for pottery called Hydro-Abrasion. This is a reduction process where a resist is applied over design elements while the negative spaces are dampened and wiped down. The result leaves a protected area elevated. There are quite a few resists that can be used to achieve desired results. I'll experiment with 3 of the more popular resists to see what the differences are. First, I'll use Mod Podge, which is a water-based glue. Second, I'll use a wax emulsion. And finally, I'll coat the third mug with shellac. The first thing I need is bone-dry greenware. I had 3 similar mugs on my shelf that would work perfectly for this experiment. First, I divided the mug into thirds with short bands at the top and bottom, and a wide swath in the center. For the design, I decided to paint flowers, butterflies, leaves, buds, and stems around the mug. This technique takes a little planning in advance to decide what elements I wanted to stand out and which elements I wanted to recede. I thought the flowers and butterflies would be the stars of the show, so I drew those first. I could just use the resist on the naked clay, but I wanted to see how the resists affect underglazes when brushed over them, so I painted the bulky flowers and the butterflies. To add a little pizzazz to the design, I drew some lines to each element and sgraffitoed through them. Now I'm ready to try the first resist, the Mod Podge. The Mod Podge is water-based, so I don't have to worry about protecting the bristles of my brush. I had members of the Pottery studio group suggest that I apply it thickly so it would have a better chance of surviving the abrading process. Since the underglaze was not fired on, I opted for dabbing the glue as opposed to brushing to avoid dislodging the underglaze. The second mug, I applied wax resist. I suggest designating a brush to be used specifically with your wax, as you don't want to contaminate anything else in your studio with the wax. In addition, I coated my bristles with a little soap before dipping it into the wax to help keep the bristles from clumping. Again, I began by dabbing to avoid lifting off the underglaze. Also, I specifically tried to apply it thickly, especially to the edges, which were more vulnerable to wearing away. Finally, I coated the shellac over the designs. Shellac is an alcohol-based resinous substance which dries very hard. Again, I designated its own brush so I don't contaminate anything else in my studio with it. I protected the bristles with soap before dipping it into the shellac. I found that the shellac was a bit thinner than the other 2 resists, and it spread out easily, so I was cautious about brushing too much along the edges of the design. The trick to avoid runs is not to overload your brush. Even though the resists looked like they were dry in several hours, I resisted temptation and waited before moving on to the next step. The Mod Podge becomes transparent when dry, so I can tell it's ready to go. I started with a container of clear water and a clean sponge. I dampened the sponge and gently wiped it over the protected areas. Looking back, I probably should have protected the bands around the top and bottom of the mug to protect them from getting too wet. Oh well, live and learn. The sponge fills with the clay slurry after just a few swipes, so I needed to rinse it out frequently. Even after just a few swipes, you can see that the background is starting to recede. I could tell already that delicate, thinly protected areas like the butterfly wing edges and the antenna were starting to erode away. Okay, that looks good so far. I did lose a butterfly head and antenna, but everything else went as planned. Second is the wax resist. You can tell the wax is dry as it also becomes transparent. Again, you can see that it doesn't take too many swipes to fill up the sponge before you need to rinse it out. Interestingly, I found that the edges of the wax were a little more fragile and didn't hold up as well as I wanted to the vigorous swiping. You can see on this butterfly I lost the antenna and the top edge of the wings. When the edges wear away, the crispness of the raised design edges erodes too, which is not what I wanted, but I still got most of the desired effect. Third is the shellac mug. I found that the shellac left a shiny hard surface over the designs. I had a little better experience obtaining crisper edges, but I still had a few areas erode away, as you can see on this butterfly and the edge of the flower. Perhaps I was too aggressive with the sponging. I decided it'd be fun to add background elements like leaves, flower buds, and stems around the foreground designs and do a second round of abrading. I drew, painted, and sgraffited them so they looked like they were behind the flowers and the butterflies. I thought I'd add sgraffito lines around the stems to try and give the resist areas places to pool in hopes that they wouldn't wear away as fast when abraded. I again applied each resist. I reapplied them to all the original flowers and butterflies to protect the areas that it had eroded away. Plus, I added them to the new design elements too. This time I remembered to add the resist to the top and the bottom bands to protect those areas. When they were totally dry, I abraded those surfaces like I did the first time. Here's the Mod Podged surface. You can see how the flowers and butterflies are raised off the surface higher than the other elements, giving the design perspective. Here's the waxed mug. You can see that the vines did not erode like the butterfly antenna. Perhaps graffitoing around the edges helped a bit to keep it from eroding. I did have a bit of erosion on several of the leaves though. Finally is the shellac mug. The edges seem much sharper and crisper than the other two. At this stage it's hard to tell if the underglaze underneath is still intact or if it's lost some of its color. After all this was dried, I bisque fired them to cone 04. First is the Mod Podged mug. I must confess that I discovered that before I fired it, I found that several areas of the glue had started to peel up. I pulled on it and found the resist would peel up on some of the elements. I took advantage of this and underglazed and re-sgraffitoed over those areas while the mug was still green. If I were to do this over, I would try and peel all the resist up before firing. Second is the waxed mug. You can see that some of the wax ash was still over top of the underglaze, making it appear washed out. But some of the areas really did wash out during the abrasion process. Now here is the shellac surface. Again, you can see some of the shellac ash over the underglaze and some of the areas that eroded, but the underglaze does appear less washed out than the waxed mug. In the end, I did have to use my fingernail to get rid of the ash. I was pleased at how intense the underglazes remained. Well, I spent some time trying to correct areas that needed touch-ups, and then I glazed all 3 mugs. I fired them all to cone 5, and here's the final result. First up out of the high fire is the Mod Podge mug. The edges of the resist on the mug were fairly sharp, but I did cheat a little by peeling off the glue and touching up the details. I gave it an overall score of 11 out of 15. It lost points for the issues of erosion during the abrading process. Next up is the Wax Resist. I found on this mug that the eroding of the wax during the abrading process resulted in more of soft slopes than crisp edges. Overall, I gave the wax a 9 out of 15 because I personally hate the messiness of wax. Check out the video link above to see why. Finally, here's the shellac mug. Because the shellac produced a harder surface, I had more luck with creating delicate edges and the erosion was minimal. It was easy to apply, but I had to be careful with it running. I also had to be careful that the kiln was well vented when firing. I gave the shellac a score of 13 out of 15. Overall, I thought it was the best resist to use for this particular project. Let us know your favorite resist in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and if you like our videos, we'd appreciate it if you'd like, share, and subscribe to our video. See you next time in the studio.